Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
When I come down to London and talk about this, I can kind of see why people get so het up about population. Because there are a lot of people here. This is a really crowded part of the planet. And if you draw maps of the planet and you take all the space without people out, it really can look like we're just surrounded by people. It's too much, it's getting too crowded. We just don't know where this is heading and what's going to go on. And also worldwide at the moment, we're living through the years of the greatest absolute increase in population. And so you can think, well, this thing is simply out of control. A couple of little maps of Europe for you. Again, just taking out all the space where there are no people. And when you do this, you can begin to see why so many people are so frightened of so many other people. This is what Europe looks like in terms of people. It's kind of Turkey coming along from the bottom, about to bite it. It's a kind of sea of cities. You can see Paris and London there. And beneath it, there are millions and millions of young people, and to the side, there are millions of young people. But there are lots of hopeful signs, and we tend not to talk about the hopeful signs. Here's a graph from the book that just shows you that the biggest progress on green technology is actually in China, not in the US. And if you're looking at the rate of progress in the bottom graph, you'll see China, South Korea, and Turkey at the top. And Britain is stuck within the rest of the EU. If you look at Turkey, that most populous part of Europe, you'll find that in Istanbul, the birth rate is lower than in London right now. In fact, right across Turkey, the birth rate is below replacement level, apart from in the most rural parts of that country. I became interested in this because I was involved in a group of people who produced a website called World Mapper, and we mapped a lot of data from the UN's 2003 based projections about the world, which went all the way to 2,300 back then. And what they showed then was that we're about 7 billion now, heading to 8.9 halfway through the century, peaking around 9.1 in 100 years' time, and then this kind of steady state on the medium variant projection, but with a lot of variability, of which people often talk about this, and they never talk about this possibility down here. That was produced in 2003 by the UN and stood all the way to 2011. In 2011, the UN altered its projection, because what they did is they upped that projection from 9.1 to 10.1 billion. They also put another scenario on, and they took all this bit out of the graph. No longer looking forward to 2,300. That is the point at which the recent scare began, was those projections released in 2011. Very conveniently, or inconveniently for me, they upped their projections again to 11 billion. I want to try to tell you why they did that, and again, why you should not worry. I've got a lot of these graphs that show you what's actually happened and what's projected to happen. And the incredible thing that's happened is this complete collapse in fertility in most of the world, apart from Africa. Africa not quite as fast. This is incredibly good news. If you had a global government and they were trying to do various things, this would be seen as a sign of success. Why did it happen? Why did fertility just begin to plummet then? It's before the one-child policy. It is coincident with contraceptive becoming available worldwide, but that, I don't think, is the nub of it. I think it happened because it had to happen. What human beings have done is since 1851, they've had a few favoured generations. The phrase "a few favoured generations" comes from Charles Darwin, who was talking about domesticated animals at the time and how they can multiply out of all number, but only for a short amount of time. We've had a kind of algae bloom of human beings, and the algae bloom is coming to an end. This is GDP figures just showing how across the world growth rates plummeted from the 1970s. This is the most important graph, and I'll update it at the end. But this is the rate of growth of human beings. If we were down here, we'd be stable. And this is what I mean about 1851. It began then. The increased growth of human beings at this incredible rate began then, and in fits and starts increased and increased. You can see why, if you're writing a book called A Population Bomb in 1968, you might think we're all doomed. It wasn't just that population has been going up all this time. In most years, it was going up more in percentage terms than the year before. It was completely out of control. And then that stopped. And for 40 years, we've had a decline in the rate of growth. To get back to a population explosion as big as the one we've just gone through, you have to go all the way back to the Neolithic Revolution, when we settled in villages. That's the last time I can find evidence of an increase in population of the same order of magnitude, when we moved from hunter and gathering around to settling in villages. What we're now doing is settling en masse in cities. You'll know that over half the world's population is in cities. This is one of the world's first cities. This has been an incredibly quick process. We seem to have this elevated view of ourselves that thinks we should understand the state we're in within just a few years. And if we can't, it's because the state we're in is not understandable, rather than accepting that something dramatic has happened. We've passed lots of peaks. And we don't tend to celebrate these, which is good, because we have to worry about the peaks we have not passed. Peak baby was around about 1990. Haven't ever got up to that level of babies we've had since 1990 again. Peak 18-year-old, I worked out the other day, I think was around about 2006. So the world now has more people in its early 20s than it's ever had and may ever have, which might explain a lot of what's going on in certain parts of the world right now. Here's a couple of Hans Rosling style graphs. Hans Rosling, if you want to look at somebody who was an inspiration for a lot of what I'm doing, he's the man who quoted the phrase, "Be a practical possibilist." See what is possible, what might actually happen. He showed how fertility rates plummet once life expectancy goes over 55. That's in 1960. That's where we are now. This is the transition that we've gone through. That would have been very hard in the 60s to have predicted. There were a few clever demographers, when you look back, who did, between the lines, write, this is unsustainable, so it will not carry on. But there weren't many of them. We've got lots and lots of current problems. One of our current problems is that we have this incredibly high and growing levels of world inequality. If you want to know where the money is going to, it's concentrated in a few particular parts of the world. But there are even some good news stories on the money. This is the wealth of the world's super rich. This is the wealth per capita. And if you're very optimistic about it, you never know. You might think, I'm being silly. The wealth per capita dropping since 2008, dropped once, then dropped a second time. But peak wealth, peak inequality in Britain was around about 1912. Nobody in 1912 knew, had any way of knowing that that might be the start of the end of the era of such huge social divisions in the UK. But from 1912 onwards, the rich became less rich, the average came up, the income and the wealth gaps between us narrowed for 70 years. It's not impossible that that kind of thing could happen worldwide. Won't happen by itself, didn't happen by itself in Britain, but it has happened before, it could happen now. Problems. We have lots of problems. I think the important thing is to try to get them in some kind of rank order and say which are worse and which are less worse. Food is a less of a problem than many other problems. Partly, the number of areas in the world that are actually at extreme risk of lack of food is relatively small. But more importantly than that, human beings have a fixed amount of food that they can consume. If we could consume 10 times more than other people, we would have a problem. The nice thing is that you will die if you do that. If it was good for you to consume a lot of meat, we would have a problem. We're very fortunate that actually consuming a lot of meat is not good for you. It doesn't stop people consuming a lot of meat, but if you imagine that meat was actually really, really good for you, it would be harder to be a bit optimistic about the future. Water's a bit more of a problem than food, but water is renewable. It's not like oil. It doesn't run out. Soil's more of a problem than water. Climate's a very big problem. I still think war's a massive problem that we've kind of forgotten about in rich countries. You can worry about rare earth elements. As you can tell, I like drawing these kind of maps. This is a map of the universe, where it's a periodic table, but scaled according to what's most common in the universe. And this is the Earth's crust. As you zoom in, what was rare becomes less rare. But if you look at what we're using the rare earth elements for, it's often things that sustain a high consumption lifestyle. They may not be as necessary as we currently think, particularly if we can learn how not to throw our phones away every few years, if somebody doesn't manage to persuade us to always buy a new model. You get blips. So in this general trend, the fertility rate falls as life expectancy goes up. These are a series of countries, and this is the track they've been on. You'll see the UK currently is going in the wrong direction. We've got a little baby boom going on right now. These things happen. Don't get fixated about them. Look at the overall trend of what's happening. Here's a map of fertility rates across Iran, in case you didn't know that the vast majority of Iran is below replacement level. Interestingly, although it wouldn't matter if it wasn't true, Muslim countries have lower fertility than non-Muslim countries with the same GDP. But the world is slowing down. People are having less children. Women are not prepared to go through a third or fourth pregnancy, more than they've ever not been prepared before, and have more power to be able to say no, to ensure that they don't have to do something they don't want to do. I've got a thing about islands, so here's an island of hope. Tikopia, tiny island, but human beings have survived on it for thousands of years, often having to do fairly nasty things to their infants to survive, but we are very good at being sustainable. We've managed to be sustainable often for a very long time. Australia might be the largest example of a sustainable population. It's outside disruption which stops us being sustainable the most. So when you're looking at that world population explosion, that world population explosion coincides incredibly well with the global spread of capitalism, moving around the world into societies, destroying established systems whereby societies kept themselves moving on an even keel. Just like enclosure in this country did the same thing. Population growth rates. The reason for the current uplifting by 1 billion and then another billion are these little peaks here that have occurred. And they've had the effect of moving these little lines up just a little bit. Population growth is a bit like compound interest. A few more babies now ends up with many more people in 100 years' time. A few less babies now ends up with far fewer people. The other thing which has occurred is people are living longer. So a large part of the increased population projected for the world isn't more people, it's just more of us around at the same time. And people find it quite hard to get their head around that. So you can bring your growth rates and your fertility rates right down, but you're still going to have population growth for some time as we age. And aging is a success. This is the UN 2011 projection. But instead of looking at the projection, I'm looking at the change each year. But I'm not actually going to look at the change, I'm going to look at the change in change. So it's the rate of acceleration or deceleration in the population. What actually happened? In the 60s and 70s, you'd had acceleration. Right? It wasn't just growing, it was growing faster each year. Then a little bit of deceleration, acceleration again, big bit of deceleration, little acceleration we've got now. That's their projection. Projections always look like this. The Bank of England used to do this for GDP, but they've stopped doing it now. And the only thing I've done in the book, which is novel, is I've noticed the gap in time between that point and that point and that point and that point. The gap in time is 18 years and then 22 years. Now, this isn't elephants. It's not fruit flies. This isn't hamsters. This is us. So what do we know about us? What did we used to do every 18 years that we now do every 22 years worldwide? That in Europe we now do every 30 years? To reproduce. What I think you can see here are baby booms. These are echoes of the post-war baby boom. The baby boom that came in 1945-46 wasn't just Europe. and USA. It was also post-independence India. It was also China just had a revolution. But the data isn't good enough back then. Our good data, and there's still lots of problems with our data, most births in many areas are still not registered. Our data is showing something which suggests that this might be a bit silly, and this little scribble might just be possible. I did something slightly more sensible than put the scribble on. I just took a replication of what's actually occurred and did it forward, and you get to 7.4 billion people. Where do you have to look for that kind of thing happening? You have to look to Hong Kong, or Macau, or Singapore, or many large Asian cities, or Barcelona, where it's 1 child per couple now. We concentrate our efforts and our interests on the idea of things going wrong, of there being ever more of us. For some reason, we don't look at those areas which might be ahead in time, where it is becoming more and more common to have remarkably few children. And we also forget that the migration that's occurring into the cities is going to drive this. The global economic downturn may drive this, but in particular the movement of more women in than men may drive it. You can leave as many men as you like out in the countryside. That's not a problem. If you can get more women into cities, you'll have fewer children faster. So the last graph. This is the graph I showed you before, with that rise up to 1971. This is what's happened since then. This is what's currently predicted to happen. And that little bump, if you can just about see it, is the reason why the UN have gone up and added another 11 billion. So it doesn't stop at 10, it stops at 11. If that little bump is the echo of a baby boom, that won't happen. If that little bump is that suddenly people feel more insecure worldwide and are having more babies for economic security, then we will have more people. One thing that I find most interesting about the spread of population and the growth of population is that it appears to go hand in hand with the increase in GDP per capita. It is not that difficult if you're a business person making widgets that people want to make a profit if there are more people next year than the year before, more people next year. Global capitalism can work with an ever-expanding population. But once population peaks, once it begins to come down, it's hard to have a model that says you have to make an ever greater profit because you haven't got ever more people to sell to. So you've got to begin to trick the people you've got into the idea that they do need to go and buy clothes every weekend. They do need to get into massive debt. What I find most interesting about population change worldwide and what's currently happening is I don't think our current way of organising things economically works with population slowdown and population decline that we're seeing in certain areas. We've just passed peak 18. We have a huge world population of 20-somethings. 20-somethings will buy things. One great thing about people aging, unless they change, is you get wiser. And as you get wiser, it's harder to sell you things that you don't actually need. These maps. This is the Earth at Night map taken a few years ago, but now spread over a population cartogram. So you're seeing where it's dark, there's less light. Where it's light, we've got light pollution. Here we are in the heart of one of the greatest sources of light pollution in Europe. If you zoom out, you can just see India beginning to encroach. The area of these maps is proportional to the number of people. The point I want to try to make in showing this is that the problem is not the people. The problem is those people who have decided that it's okay to waste energy to shine light up to the sky that is of use to nobody but NASA in producing their maps of the world. Our problem is overconsumption of some people in some places and not having worked out how to do things better so that we don't waste as much resources and as much energy as we currently do. It's us here, it's them over there on the eastern seaboard, it's the Californians, it's where Barack Obama comes from, a few cities in Latin America, and a few cities in Asia which are still polluting too much, whereas the consumption here is much, much lower. But just follow this little pattern here. That's the Nile. And I'll take you forward now to the latest NASA picture, which is December 2012. and you can see the change. Tokyo's actually become less bright, whereas Alexandria and the Cairo are now shining very brightly indeed. What we need to do as we're moving forward is work out how we can stop that map becoming brighter and brighter and brighter as people waste energy signing it up. How do you get to a world where wherever you are, you have enough light to be able to read and do the things you need to do at night, but not an economic system that means you don't have to worry about wasting things. Thank you very much.